Welcome back from track out. So we're ready to talk now about colonization, right? We're starting our units on colonization. And of course, we need to start by talking about the first three major colonies, the early English settlement attempts and successful attempts this time instead of the lost colony, which we know was an unsuccessful attempt. We're going to review a little bit about that during this unit, but not very much since we spent so much time on it in Unit 1. Um, so if you see in the map that's there on the screen, you'll see that it says Jamestown 1607. So that's where we're going to start with the colony of Jamestown, talking about how that colony really set the stage for the way Europeans colonized the rest of America. So, exploration, trade, and colonies, right? This was the most important thing. We have to remember the Columbian Exchange. We also have to remember the three G's, right? Gold, glory, God. That's why they're there. They need to explore, they need trade, and they know that building colonies is making them money, right? And ultimately, they also believe that there's going to be lots of gold in the Americas that they're going to be able to find and bring back to England to create great wealth in England. All right. I also want you to remember about the Columbian Exchange and mercantilism. We talked a lot about that in Unit 1. But this whole idea that this exchange was for the benefit of Great Britain, right? That was going to bring them that glory and that wealth. Okay, so by the 1600s, when Jamestown began, by those 1600s, slavery was established due to the rise of plantations, especially in the South of the United States. So, of the not the United States, the New World. So, slavery was established. They start thinking about how are we going to get the workforce that we need. A lot of people still didn't want to come to the New World from Great Britain. They didn't think it was a great idea. They weren't keen on it. It was still a dangerous passage, so they weren't interested in it. So that meant that they had to figure out another way to get labor, and unfortunately, that came in the way of slave labor. Right? European colonies used slaves for work on farms, and they used them as any manual labor that they could find. We know that they had slaves who worked in the homes, in the kitchens, in farming, in logging industry, all kinds of different things like that. And the rise in slavery led to the prominence of something we call the triangular trade. So we're going to look at that on the next slide there. Okay, so the triangular trade refers to the three continents of um, the trade between the three continents. Sorry, y'all, I'm moving myself up there so you can see the whole map here, right? So they became more and more dependent on slavery because they were building bigger farms. They had more work that needed to be done. So they created this triangular trade, which is the three continents of origin, right? Europe, America, and Africa. Okay, when we get to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the Middle Passage. But of course, from Africa, the slaves came to the Americas, right? We can see that here. Africa, the slaves came to the Americas. From the Americas came sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which went to Europe. And from Europe, textiles, rum, and manufactured goods went to Africa. So all of this trade was working to grow the New World for the European colonists. So the Middle Passage refers to the part of the trade where Africans were packed into densely packed into ships and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the West Indies. Okay, they call it the triangular. The Middle Passage is what they call the transition of the slaves, the transfer of the slaves from the African colony to the Americas. And this picture that you see here is just a visual representation of how they would fit lots and lots of slaves on one ship. So you see here it says at the top it says the lower deck would have had 292 slaves on it, right? So they were densely packed in these ships. Very poor conditions, and many, many, many Africans died on the way to the Americas due to the poor conditions that they were in. Okay, so some review from Unit 1. Don't forget Amadis and Barlow, Lane, White, and the Lost Colony. We have to remember those things, right? That was the first attempt at colonization by Great Britain, and it didn't end well, right? The lost colony is still lost, right? So some things that they learned, Great Britain learned that colonization is expensive, it's risky, and it's time consuming. So they had to come ready the next time with a better plan on how to colonize the Americas. Okay, so one of the things that they chose to do was to create joint stock companies. Okay, joint stock companies were companies that invested in the colonies with the expectations that they would make lots and lots of money. So I'm reminding you here to think about mercantilism, right? They knew that these colonies were going to create um, a capability for them to make lots and lots of money. That was the whole plan in colonization, right? Each investor owned part of the colony and they split the profits. So they became like big companies, conglomerates that foot the bill for the folks who wanted to colonize America to get to the Americas and build the colonies. And then when they started farming, if they found gold, whatever wealth that was made from this colony would be sent back to Great Britain to these companies. So the first big joint stock company that was involved in American colonization was the Virginia Company of London. And the Virginia Company of London funded Jamestown. So if you'll see here in this cartoon here, this is a political cartoon. So we have a big joint stock company, Jack and the Giant joint stock. So that's a great allusion to Jack and the Beanstalk, right? We'll talk about that a little bit in class. All right, Jamestown. Jamestown is the first successful British colony. They made it in Jamestown. That's very important. It's located on the James River, which they believed would be safe from Spanish attacks. It was established in 1607. It was not immediately a successful colonization attempt. They suffered from the climate. It was a lot different than it was in London, where most of the colonizers came from, and they had a lot of sickness on the way there in the ships. When they got to the Americas, there was quite a bit of sickness, and they suffered greatly under that sickness. Okay, so when Jamestown began, the first problem that Jamestown had was that they believed the colony had gold. Remember the three G's? That's why they're there, right? So they spent time searching for gold instead of farming and hunting. Not a good plan. Winter time came. As a result, many colonists died and many became very ill. They weren't well fed. They starved to death. They didn't have good shelter for the climate. So they ended up with a real big problem. I'm going to move this screen again. Sorry about that. So John Smith, Captain John Smith here, can tell I'm at school, y'all. The lights just turned off on me. Captain John Smith took control of the colony and he helped them learn how to survive. I want you to think about the story of Pocahontas. If you don't know anything about Pocahontas, research it and come to class this week with questions, okay? Under John Smith's leadership, a lot of things happened. The most important thing that happened was that they learned to build shelters and to hunt and to farm. They needed to know how to hunt and farm, right? They began trading with the Native Americans. They became friendly with the Native Americans who were there. It was also important because the Native Americans knew how to live in the New World, right? With the help of a guy named John Rolfe, they learned to grow tobacco, which is still a cash crop in North Carolina and Virginia, right? And tobacco made the colony a lot of money, which of course made the Virginia Company very happy, right? Because that's why they had invested in the first place. Okay. A few years later, the Virginia Company failed. Okay, so they closed down. They shut their doors. So this created an interesting situation for King James I. And he decided that he would make Jamestown a royal colony. So instead of being sponsored by the Virginia Company, the royal colony meant that the government would sponsor it, right? So this was important. Now the country of England is going to make the money instead of a company, right? And that also meant that the country of England had dominion over the inner workings of the colony. They were in charge now of what was going on. The Plymouth Colony. A group of people called separatists wanted to separate from the Church of England. Okay, so we had Jamestown, that's the first colony. Second colony is the Plymouth Colony. And this was a group of people that they called separatists in England, and they wanted to get rid of the Church of England. They wanted to get away from the Church of England. And when they said that, King James persecuted them. He treated them very badly. So they left England and created a colony in the New World. They thought that they could be in charge of themselves and that they could be separate from the Church of England. On the way to America, these men signed the Mayflower Compact, which created a system of self-government for their colony. It's really important. They became democratic in nature. So These colonists at Plymouth became known as the Pilgrims. We know that. We've heard that before. And they were known as Pilgrims because they moved to escape religious persecution. We're going to talk about the meaning of this word pilgrim during this week, okay? The colony struggled at first, but the Native Americans helped them. Think about Squanto and the story of Thanksgiving. Okay, the third colony is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans, who were a group of people who literally wanted to purify the Church of England. So they were more conservative. They were a more conservative group. They didn't want to just be separate from the Church of England. They wanted to make the Church of England more stringent, more strict. Um, and when they fought and fought and fought about the Church of England, they were persecuted. So they left England for the New World. So we'll talk a little bit about the differences between the Puritans and the Pilgrims during class, okay? Just don't forget about that. So they created the Massachusetts Bay Colony, okay? And they were supported by a joint stock company called the Massachusetts Bay Company, right? They wanted a strict regulation of religion by the government. They believed that the government and religious laws should be the same, and their religious-based laws regulated everything that happened in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They wanted exclusive colonies. They only wanted people who believed the way they believed, and they would actually exclude people from even being able to trade inside of their colony if they didn't have the correct belief systems. The Puritans said they wanted religious freedom. That's what they said they came to England for. From England for religious freedom. But really, they wanted religious freedom for themselves. They were completely intolerant of other people's belief systems. So, those ideas of religious intolerance and persecution of people who didn't believe the way you believed started to spread to the other colonies, and religious persecution actually became a way of life in the New World. And when you guys get to 11th and 12th grade, you're going to learn a whole lot about that in terms of American literature and British literature, but we'll be spending a little bit of time reading a few things like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God to see exactly how extreme the Puritans became. Okay, y'all have a good day.